Imagine waking up to find your dream home turning into a nightmare. Not because of fire or theft, but because of the very people who were supposed to protect the neighborhood. The HOA. One letter in the mailbox turned into threats, fines, and something far darker than anyone could have expected. Neighbors whispered, board members smiled, and every move I made was under their watchful eye. But when they pushed too far, crossing a line no one should ever cross, I decided it was time to fight back. The only question was, how much would it cost them? When Sarah and Daniel bought their home on Willow Creek Lane, it felt like the beginning of everything they had worked for. A modest 2-story house with a wide front porch, a patch of green lawn, and enough space for their kids to ride bikes in the driveway. It wasn't luxury, but it was theirs. After years of renting small apartments, the sense of permanence was intoxicating. They could finally paint the walls any color they wanted, plant flowers in the yard, and host backyard barbecues without worrying about a landlord's complaints. At first glance, the neighborhood seemed perfect. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed trees, and kids played tag until dusk. Friendly waves greeted them from neighbors walking their dogs. Sarah often thought to herself, this is the kind of place where memories are made. Daniel, ever the practical one, liked the security of a tight-knit community. They noticed the HOA almost immediately. Its welcome packet, its cheerful newsletter about yard sales and block parties, its promises of keeping the neighborhood orderly and beautiful. For a while, everything was smooth. Their days were filled with school drop-offs, late-night grocery runs, and weekend trips to the park. Sarah loved tending to the garden, while Daniel spent hours tinkering in the garage. The HOA seemed distant, a background presence they barely noticed. Occasionally, they'd get reminders about trash bins needing to be pulled in by a certain time, or friendly notices about upcoming meetings. Nothing alarming. Nothing suggested storm clouds ahead, but in every community, beneath the polished lawns and polite smiles, there are undercurrents you don't see until you're in too deep. Sarah began to notice how certain neighbors' lawns were measured by tape, how cars parked slightly outside painted lines earned notes on their windshields, how small choices, a basketball hoop left too long in a driveway, a flower pot that didn't match the aesthetic, became whispered conversations. The HOA wasn't just about keeping order, it was about control. The first hint of trouble came with something so small, it almost seemed laughable. A letter, folded neatly in their mailbox, stamped with the HOA seal. It wasn't a fine, not yet, just a notice. Their mailbox, according to the board, wasn't uniform with the others on the street. Sarah frowned at the letter, holding it out to Daniel as if it was some kind of prank. Their mailbox was sturdy, painted, and in perfect working condition. But apparently, it wasn't the right kind. Daniel brushed it off. It's a mistake. We'll clear it up. But Sarah felt uneasy. It was the tone of the letter, cold and formal, like a warning instead of a request, as if someone, somewhere, had decided they didn't quite belong. From that day forward, things shifted. Neighbors, who once waved, now watched a little too closely. Board members who had been friendly now seemed distant, their conversations clipped. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Sarah felt it in her bones. Something was changing. What Sarah and Daniel didn't know was that the mailbox letter was just the beginning. The HOA had rules written in fine print, enforced with iron fists. And the couple, unknowingly, had just stepped onto a path that would pit them against the very system running their neighborhood. The peace they thought they had found on Willow Creek Lane was about to shatter, and the people breaking it weren't strangers. They were their neighbors. The mailbox letter should have been nothing. A small formality, an easy correction, a forgettable hiccup in the middle of their otherwise happy new life. But instead, it was the first loose thread that once tugged unraveled everything Sarah and Daniel thought they knew about their neighborhood. 2 weeks after the letter, another notice arrived. This time, it wasn't about the mailbox. It was about the flower beds. Sarah had planted tulips in front of the porch, bright yellows and deep reds that made the home feel warm and welcoming. But the HOA claimed they were not within the approved landscaping colour palette. Sarah blinked at the letter in disbelief. A colour palette? For flowers? Daniel laughed it off at first. They can't control nature, Sarah. This is ridiculous. But the laughter faded when the second half of the letter became clear. A fine. $50, payable immediately, with the warning that additional penalties would follow if the flowers weren't removed or replaced. Sarah felt humiliated. Her small act of joy, of personal expression, was being reduced to a violation. Still, she and Daniel decided not to give in. If we back down now, Daniel said firmly, they'll think they can push us around forever. So the tulips stayed. That's when the real campaign began. A week later, Sarah noticed a neighbour she barely knew snapping photos of their front yard. The following day, another letter arrived. This one accusing them of leaving their trash bin visible for too long after collection day. The fine, $100. Then it was the garage door. Apparently, the shade of beige Daniel had chosen to repaint it was too dark compared to the approved shade. Another fine, $200 this time. Each letter came with an escalating sense of menace, as if the HOA were circling closer and closer, waiting for them to slip. It wasn't just the fines, it was the atmosphere. Neighbours who once smiled now avoided eye contact. The board president, a sharp-eyed woman named Carol, seemed to take particular interest in their home. She drove by slowly, sometimes twice a day, her phone in hand, documenting. Sarah swore she once saw Carol measuring their lawn with a tape measure. The couple tried to fight back. Daniel attended a board meeting, hoping to reason with them. He stood in the stuffy, fluorescent-lit room, surrounded by a semicircle of board members who stared at him as though he were on trial. He explained the mailbox, the tulips, and the garage door. He argued that these rules were absurd, petty, and unfair. But when he finished, Carol leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Rules are rules, Mr. Williams," she said. "If everyone did whatever they wanted, this neighborhood would fall apart." The meeting ended with laughter from a few board members and silence from the rest. Daniel walked out, red-faced and seething. He realized then that the board wasn't interested in fairness. They were interested in control, and control was exactly what they began to tighten. Letters turned into fines. Fines turned into liens. The HOA now claimed they had the authority to place a lien on their property if the violations continued unpaid. Sarah felt her chest tighten with anxiety every time she opened the mailbox. Their dream, home, the sanctuary they had worked so hard for, was being weaponized against them. The stress seeped into their lives. Sarah found herself awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every small decision they'd made. Did they really leave the trash bin out too long? Did she plant too many flowers? Was Daniel's paint really the wrong shade? It was like living under a microscope, every action scrutinized and judged. But the worst part wasn't the fines. It was the harassment. One morning, Sarah stepped outside to find their tulips ripped out, their roots lying in a heap on the sidewalk. Her hands shook as she knelt beside the broken stems, tears welling in her eyes. Daniel stormed around the yard, furious. But there were no witnesses, no cameras, no proof. Just silence from the neighbors' windows, curtains pulled back slightly, as if watching, waiting. Then came the letters with no signatures, slipped under their door at night. Notes that said things like, "Follow the rules or move out," or "People like you don't belong here." The handwriting was scrawled, anonymous, impossible to trace. The couple reported the harassment to the HOA, but Carol only smirked. "If you're having issues with neighbors, perhaps you should reconsider how you fit into this community," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. By now, Sarah and Daniel were desperate. They tried appealing the fines, filing formal complaints, and even contacting an attorney. but the HOA bylaws were written in dense, tangled legal language that gave the board sweeping powers. The attorney shook his head. They've written this in an airtight way. Fighting them will cost you more than the fines themselves. It felt like checkmate. But Daniel wasn't ready to give up. They want us to break. They want us to sell and leave. But we're not giving them that satisfaction. So they dug in. They paid some fines, ignored others, and tried to live as normally as possible. But the HOA escalated further. One morning, they received notice that the board intended to sue for unpaid violations. Thousands of dollars in alleged damages. The letter was delivered by hand, Carol herself standing at the door, smiling as she passed it over. Sarah could barely breathe. It was no longer just about tulips or mailboxes. It was about their home, their future, their sanity. And still, the harassment didn't stop. Their mailbox was smashed with a baseball bat. Their car was keyed in the driveway. A neighbor's dog dug holes in their lawn. Yet somehow it was they who received a violation for unsightly property damage. It was a nightmare loop with no escape. Sarah broke down one night at the kitchen table, bills spread out in front of her. "They're going to take everything from us," she whispered. Daniel squeezed her hand, his jaw tight. "No," he said. "They've underestimated us. They think we're weak, but they have no idea what's coming." Because while Sarah and Daniel felt trapped, powerless, crushed under the weight of the HOA's campaign, Daniel had quietly begun researching. He stayed up late after Sarah went to bed, poring over documents, bylaws, and court cases. And the more he read, the more he realized the HOA wasn't as untouchable as they thought. Hidden in the dense legal jargon were contradictions, overreaches, even outright violations of state housing law. The board, in its arrogance, had been abusing power in ways that left it vulnerable. Very vulnerable. Daniel began building a case. Piece by piece, violation by violation, he gathered evidence, not just of their unfair treatment, but of the HOA's corruption, unauthorized spending, selective enforcement, even favoritism towards certain board members' properties. He quietly contacted other homeowners who had been fined or harassed, and one by one, they began to share their own stories. A network of resentment and frustration began to form. Sarah, though still shaken, found new strength in knowing they weren't alone. What had felt like a personal vendetta was actually part of a much larger pattern. The Williamses weren't the first family to be targeted, but they just might be the last to take it lying down. And as the HOA prepared to drag them into court, confident in their power, Daniel prepared something of his own, a plan that would expose the board's corruption and turn the tables once and for all. The question wasn't whether the fight would end. It was how far the HOA would go before they realized they'd picked the wrong family to push around. The morning of the hearing arrived like a storm cloud. Sarah barely slept. The weight of weeks, no, months, of harassment sat heavy in her chest as she dressed in silence. Daniel, calm but tight-jawed, carried a leather folder filled with the evidence he had spent nights compiling. To Sarah, it looked like hope pressed into paper. The HOA had filed its lawsuit for thousands of dollars in unpaid fines, claiming the Williamses had violated rule after rule, each more absurd than the last. The board believed this was their victory, a lap, their chance to humiliate Sarah and Daniel, force them into submission, or even drive them out altogether. Carol, the HOA president, wore her victory on her face the moment they walked into the courthouse. She stood tall in a navy blue blazer, flanked by two board members, smirking as if the verdict had already been written. Sarah gripped Daniel's hand so tightly, her knuckles turned white. He gave her a steady glance, a silent promise. "Trust me." The courtroom filled quickly. Other homeowners, curious neighbors, even people who had quietly suffered under the HOA's heavy hand filed into the gallery. Whispers buzzed through the air like static. The Williamses weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. This felt bigger, a crack in the HOA's armor that everyone desperately wanted to see widen. When the judge entered and the proceedings began, Carol's attorney launched into a tirade. Slide after slide, projected onto a screen. Photos of the offending. Tulips, the mailbox, the garbage bin left out too long. He spoke with the self-righteousness of someone who believed order was on his side. The Williamses, he declared, have repeatedly disrespected community standards. Their negligence threatens property values, harmony, and the quality of life for all residents. The HOA has been left with no choice but to enforce its rules through legal action. The words were sharp, but they felt rehearsed. Empty. Still, Sarah's stomach twisted. Hearing their home reduced to a list of violations was like being stripped, bare in front of the entire room. Then, it was Daniel's turn. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie, and walked to the center with the quiet confidence of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm. "This case isn't about tulips. It isn't about mailboxes, paint colors, or trash bins. This case is about power, about a board that has twisted its authority into a weapon. And today, we're going to show you exactly how deep that abuse runs." He opened his folder, and, one by one, he laid the documents on the table. His voice carried with steady precision, every word a nail driving into the coffin the HOA had built for themselves. First came the selective enforcement, photos of other homes with mismatched mailboxes, no fines. Garages painted in shades far darker or lighter, no letters. Trash bins left out overnight, week after week, no warnings. Daniel turned toward Carol, his gaze piercing. "The rules were only rules when we broke them," the gallery murmured. Next came the financial records. Daniel had filed a public records request and discovered irregularities in the HOA's spending. Thousands of dollars unaccounted for, checks written to consultants who turned out to be relatives of board members, funds diverted for community, projects that never materialized. Carol shifted in her seat, her smirk faltering. But Daniel wasn't finished. He presented state housing statutes. Clear, unmistakable language that limited HOAs from issuing excessive fines, from retaliating against homeowners who challenged them, and from placing liens without proper process. "Every violation they've issued against us," Daniel said, his voice rising, "was not only unfair, it was illegal." He then called forward other residents. One by one they stood, hesitant at first, then emboldened by Daniel's resolve. A widow was fined for leaving her wheelchair ramp visible. A young couple was threatened for having children's toys in their yard. An elderly man who had paid thousands in maintenance fees, only to discover the HOA never completed the promised work. Their voices cracked with emotion, each story painting the board as less of a guardian of order and more of a tyrant ruling by intimidation. The judge leaned forward, her expression hardening with every testimony. By the time Daniel returned to his seat, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The board's attorney shuffled his papers nervously, his earlier confidence drained. Carol sat rigid, jaw clenched, her earlier smugness replaced by the unmistakable look of someone cornered. And then, it happened. The moment that broke everything. Open. Daniel pulled out one last document, saving it like a blade unsheathed at the perfect moment. It was an email, obtained through a disgruntled former board secretary, in which Carol herself wrote, "We need to make an example out of the Williamses. If we push hard enough, they'll either fold or move. That will keep the others in line." Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Sarah covered her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. It was proof. Cold, undeniable proof that everything they had endured wasn't about community standards or neighborhood harmony. It was about personal vendetta and control. The judge's gavel struck once, silencing the room. "Enough," she said sharply, her tone cutting through the tension. She turned to the board's attorney, who fumbled for words, then to Carol, who sat pale and silent, her power evaporating in real time. When the judge spoke again, her words landed like thunder. "This court finds the HOA's actions to be not only excessive, but also retaliatory and unlawful. The fines are hereby nullified, and the HOA is ordered to cease its harassment immediately." Furthermore, this case will be referred to the State Attorney General's office for investigation into financial misconduct. The room erupted. Some cheered, some gasped, and others whispered in disbelief. Carol's face was crimson, her hands trembling as she tried to gather her papers. The once untouchable board was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Sarah turned to Daniel, her heart pounding. For the first time in months, she felt air fill her lungs without the weight of fear pressing down. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were winning. But the fight wasn't over.